Hello, I'm Jake Archibald, DevRel on the Chrome team. But I also do bits of standards work as well. I want to give a talk about shared element transitions, which is something I'm helping out with right now. So, the state of things. When you navigate from one document to another on the web, the page just changes. But over in platform apps, particularly on mobile, you get these lovely transitions between states. It's slightly nauseating having them all happening side by side like this, but when you're using it in reality, it's a really nice experience. It's kind of delightful, but also in some cases it improves the user experience by communicating things like direction of travel and elements that are conceptually the same between states. So why can't we have that on the web? I asked folks on Twitter if they'd be interested in a feature like this, and I asked if they'd be interested in it for multi-page apps or single-page apps. And people voted very strongly in favour of multi-page apps, and their main reason was, well, you can kind of do it with single-page apps already, but it's impossible with multi-page apps. In fact, there was a strong feeling that many sites become SPAs just to be able to do transitions like this. I don't know if that's actually true, but there's definitely a feeling that way. And of course, if it is true, then that's a problem, because we know creating an SPA is a huge leap in architectural complexity, and often done badly. I mean, even when it's done by the experts, you lose things like progressive rendering, like HTML streaming. You often gain like a large JavaScript bundle at the end unless you're very carefully optimizing that. So we've been thinking about what we can do in this space. But we're not the first to think about this. In 2015, another group of folks at Chrome, at Google, they had a proposal and even a rough implementation, but unfortunately various people left the company before that plan was realized. Chris Lord, who was at Mozilla at the time, wrote a sketch. I'll include links to all of this in the description. There was also me. I wrote a proposal. Tab Atkins wrote a kind of outline of a spec for this kind of thing. And here we are now. And we're trying to learn from everything that came beforehand, like why some ideas didn't develop any further, the problems with the other ideas. And we're just really trying to get it done this time. But we're not even the first to ship code for this. Back in 1997, Internet Explorer 4, if you can remember that, shipped with navigation transitions. This is what they look like, a lovely little meta tag here. So this is a page enter transition. This was 24 years ago. Who's feeling old now? Did you actually use these back in the day? I know I did. Used to crash Internet Explorer quite a lot when I tried to use it. Probably down to me having a dodgy graphics card at the time. I'm not blaming the IE team for that. Anyway, this is a page enter transition. Takes 0.6 seconds, and it uses transition number 6, and that is wipe right. There were 22 transitions to choose from, mostly in groups of 4, because each one had a variance that was up, down, left, and right, except for things like fade. There was a couple which didn't have a direction to them. Oh, how could I forget? There's a special 23rd transition, which means that it would pick a random one each time, which gave you a really 90s PowerPoint feel to your web experience. Making fun of this a bit, but I do think that a predefined set of transitions like this would actually satisfy quite a lot of use cases. Probably maybe even most people's use cases for transitions on the web. But not everyone. We heard this from a few people on Twitter. Folks want more control and want to be able to do fancier stuff. And I think that's great. We really want to unlock the creative potential of developers, right? That's partly what we're here to do. In fact, some of the nicest transitions, this is one from the Android docs, they animate multiple things in different ways, and elements appear to be shared between both states. We can see here that the name of the guy in the contacts list transitions to be the heading of his contact page. So you can, it scales, it changes color, the avatar comes along with it. Those menu items are all animating slightly independently. Pretty complicated. But let's take a web example, like my blog. I'm not a designer, never claimed to be a designer, but this is what my blog looks like. I tried to think about how transitions would work on my blog. So this is the index page and this is the article page. So I mocked this together and created a transition which does this. There you go. Just to make it clear, I'll play that in slow motion. Here we go. Ooh. You have to provide your own sound effects to that. But even a simple transition like this, there's a lot of moving parts there. There are these bits. These are all like different elements on either side of the transition. I mean, they have to be. It's a page navigation, right? So even the HTML element is different. But conceptually, these are the same. They're in the same position on each page, and they have the same content. They don't appear to change at all. Then there is this. The content of this element doesn't appear to change, but it does change position. So it moves around like that. And then there's this. This is the heading text. This element crossfades with its counterpart on the other side of the transition. Not that it doesn't scale. It just like overlays over the top. There's a bit of clipping there as well. And then there's the container of the heading. It transforms to its counterpart by changing its height, but it also uses a clip path there to keep those rounded corners the correct kind of round, rather than stretching. And finally, there's the rest, the main content. This is completely different between the pages. It's at a different vertical position as well, so that moves and crossfades. And that's it. The result you get is a nice transition between those pages. Okay, so even a transition like this, there's quite a lot of moving parts, but the important thing is that was all done with textures. I mocked this up just using like images that I cut out from a screenshot of my blog. And that means there was no layout needed for each frame of that animation, which is great for performance. But that also means that we don't need both pages to be live during that transition. The API for all of this is in flux right now. We're redesigning it, we're developing it. So I'm not going to show the API. I could do a future video, I guess. Well, I definitely will do in a future video, I'm sure of it. But there are some concepts that we keep coming back to. At some point there's a change. Can't get away from that. It already happens. You click a link on the document, you go to another document, there's the change. But I think we need this thing before it, this preparation step, like where the outgoing page offers up parts of itself to be involved in the transition. Like you saw that with my blog there. I'd be offering up like, here's the heading, here's the sidebar, here's the content. Like here they are as separate parts. I want them to be rendered separately and offered up to the other side as separate parts to be animated around. The change happens and then the old page is gone. And that's why it's important that these things are just textures, because we can't lay out something that doesn't exist anymore. Those areas of the page are just now something like textures, maybe not quite like textures, but very similar to textures. Once a new page is there, it declares when and how the textures from the old page are transitioned to their equivalents in the new page. If indeed there are equivalents, there are some cases where something new is appearing or something old is going away. But the new page is in charge of all of that. The new page won't be able to read pixel data of these textures for security and privacy reasons, for the same reasons we can't do pixel reads of the DOM today. But that means that this new page is kind of trusting what the old page gave it. The old page is saying, here is a texture, it is the heading, and the new page receives that information and it just has to trust it, really. And that creates an issue for cross-origin transitions. Because you could have a situation where the outgoing page is offering up this thing that it calls its heading, and that, but it could be an evil page, and it could be giving that to a reputable news website. Say the reputable news website receives this heading thing and starts animating it around its page with its own heading, but it's actually, I don't know, the QAnon logo. And now a reputable news website is throwing the QAnon logo around, and people are going mad on Twitter saying, oh my God, they support the conspiracy, it's a sign, and whatever. And although this would only happen for the duration of the transition, it's not good. We don't want sites being tricked into doing stuff like this. So we're thinking about cross-origin transitions. We think they'll need to be restricted in some fairly heavy way. So you can only do maybe very, very simple transitions, maybe even similar to the IE4 basic set. Or, alternatively, both sides have some kind of opt-in, that they agree to share information, or they agree to trust each other for the sake of the transition. We need to also be careful. Of course, two sites opting into sharing information and trusting each other is one problem. The other problem, of course, is cases where we don't want them. They want to share information, but we don't want to let them for privacy reasons. What I'm saying is we're thinking about it. We don't have concrete answers for this yet. There's also single-page app transitions. Like I said, people are more excited about MPA, but they're not uninterested in this for SPAs. And this is because SPA transitions are actually pretty hard to implement. Because you're in a situation where you need to have DOM for both states, the before and after state at the same time. So you'll need to make your CSS work for that. You know, these two things being side by side, overlaid in some way, potentially. You need to make sure they can't be interacted with during the transition. That's something a lot of sites get wrong. You can end up clicking things multiple times as they're going away. You end up in a very, very broken state. You need to make sure accessibility tooling doesn't misinterpret the mid-transition state. If accessibility tooling sees both the outgoing and incoming state at the same time, that could be very confusing. Or even if it locks on to the new state, when the new state, when the old state is removed and it's just a new state left, will it see that as a new announcement? You know, something's changed, even though it's actually just the old thing going away. A lot of complicated edge cases there. There's things like scroll position as well. We talked to developers at Twitter, the people who do the Twitter website, and they told us that they don't do transitions in their mobile website for these reasons, because it's just too hard. So we've been wondering if we can make this easier as well, while still allowing for expressive animations. And it seems like, well, maybe this model works there as well. We've got a change still. It's not a navigation change. It's not a page navigation, but it's just a DOM change. But the model still works. You still have this preparation phase where it's like, here's the things I want to, use as part of my transition. Those things go away. You're left with the textures, and then the new state declares how the transition should be performed. In fact, we do have a sketch of this model implemented in Chrome Canary. This is the Preact website. Preact's a React-like framework, if you haven't encountered it before. Their website is built using Preact, as you might imagine, so it's a single-page app. The author of this site says it's in need of an upgrade. It's a bit of a mess internally. But even with that, I was able to just go in and find the router it uses and find that change point where the content changes. And I was able to add either side of it, the prepare step and the transition step. With a very small amount of code, I was able to turn it into this. So it's just what we saw before, but with just some nice little slide transitions going on there. Different transition depending on the page. The back and forward buttons work. The interesting thing about this, the API that we have in Canary right now, it's kind of similar in spirit to the old IE4 thing. The thing I was making fun of earlier, as in it's just a predefined list of effects that you can use. Here I'm mostly using a slide from a particular direction. The extra bit here is the shared element thing, and that lets me identify elements on either side of the change that should animate independently. In this case, I'm really using it to keep things like the header and the sidebar in place for the transition, so you just see everything else transitioning, not the sidebar there, not the heading at the top. Although I'm a fan of low-level approaches, because of the creativity it gives developers, I do think there's room for a higher-level API here that lets people do quite a lot, but without a lot of effort or thinking. Some interesting problems that I think we're encountering that might benefit from a more general solution. First up, crossfading. We're doing a lot of crossfading in these transitions. It's a big part of it. And doing crossfading is hard in CSS. It's kind of impossible to crossfade between elements in CSS, especially when they involve transparency. A naive solution is to have put these two things on top of each other and animate their opacities in each direction. One from 1 to 0 and the other from 0 to 1. But the maths doesn't work out when you do that. Here are two elements that are crossfading using opacity. The elements are identical, except one has these extra 4 nonsense words at the end. But you can see the opacity is changing across the whole thing. And that's because 50% opacity on top of 50% opacity gives you 75% opacity, and that's what you're seeing there. In case it's not clear, you can definitely see it happening here with this image. You can see that it's sort of slightly fading out. CSS does have this though, which is the right thing in terms of the transition. It does the correct crossfade between these two images. It only operates on images, not elements. But it also transitions the size of the images from one to the other, which is sometimes what we want. But as you saw from my blog example, it quite often isn't what we want. We saw it with the when I was animating the content, when I was animating the heading text, I wasn't transitioning the size of the textures. One was just overlaid on top of the other. It'd be nice if we could have a blend mode that could maybe do the right thing here, allow us to crossfade two elements. I don't know if that's possible. Or expand on the crossfade syntax here so it has object fit and object type, well, object fit and object position, I guess, features like that. I will say that we're not dealing with elements as such in page transitions, but it'd be nice to align as close as possible with CSS concepts. Actually, that's worth talking about individually, I think. When we're transitioning these things around, they're not quite elements and they're not quite images either. They're not elements because their page is gone. We can't run layout on them anymore. But they're not quite images because they will draw outside of their bounding box if they have like drop shadows or blurs, that kind of thing. And also if they, we might store things like rotation and skew separately, particularly things that change the element's representation from a rectangle to a quad. That's something we might continue to store the texture as a rectangle because that's the shape textures are, but then have the the extra transform as an extra bit of metadata. This is something we're still trying to figure out. We need to figure out a way of representing this without straying too far away from the concepts that we have today on the web. Another thing we're trying to figure out is timings and deadlines. Right now, you follow a link, the browser switches from one page to another, kind of when it feels like it. The spec is really vague. It says something like, after parsing has begun, before script executes, certainly before page load, switch the pages around. However, if the incoming page wants to control that, it needs a way to flag that. It needs a way to say, hey, look, I want to do a page transition here. This isn't our API, this is just an example. But if the incoming page can make a signal like this, how long do we wait for that signal? We need a deadline of sorts. We can't just wait for the onload event or whatever. That would be far too long. It would cause a lot of pages to be slow if they aren't providing this signal. But once the signal is sent, how long do we let it delay itself appearing? Progressive rendering is one of my favorite fundamental features of the web, but there is a bit of a tension between progressive rendering and page transitions because you want some of the new page to be there before you transition to it. And it might be that you want more of the page there than the browser would otherwise give you as part of the loading process. You don't want to transition to a page which just has the header at the top. You want some content. So the question here is, do we just let people create slow experiences like this one here, waiting for a massive image to load, which could be many megabytes in size? Do we let them wait for that before their page is shown? I mean, maybe that's okay. People can already create slow experiences. We don't stop them. Like if their server is slow, we'll wait minutes for it to respond. So why is this any different? Or do we step in and set some boundaries? Like we do with font loading, for instance. Like if the font takes longer than 3 seconds to load, we just fall back to the old font. We could do something similar here. Like, if you're not ready to declare your transition within 5 seconds or whatever, we're just going to ignore the transition and swap the pages around. If you have any thoughts or questions about this, well, this was originally a presentation to the CSS working group, but if you found this video somewhere, then feel free to drop a comment in the just below. I think I'm putting this on YouTube. Yeah, make a YouTube comment. Make it a nice one, and I'll get back to you. Thank you very much.